Welcome to Sputnik, orbiting the world with me, George Galloway.
And me, Gayatri.
Having subverted Yugoslavia for decades, Britain and the United States bombed and splintered the country into an alphabet soup of new states: Serbia, Montenegro, Croatia, Slovenia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, which then further broke up. And then the West liberated Kosovo out of Serbia and recognized its unilateral declaration of independence in absolute defiance of international law and the United Nations Charter. I wonder how that's going.
This is, of course, in stark contradiction to their stance on Crimea, where both the US and the UK are intent on dragging the world back to Cold War over a democratic vote by the people of Crimea to rejoin Russia. And the contradiction doesn't even make either John Kerry or William Hague blush.
And NATO enforced a peace in Bosnia, which has turned out not to be peaceful or even stable. And the state of Bosnia-Herzegovina, a rickety three-legged stool with three distinct ethnic groups rotating the presidency of the state, looks distinctly shaky, with predictions of a Bosnian spring now thickening the air. Now joining us is Professor David Chandler of Westminster University. David, first of all, has the breakup of Yugoslavia been a success or a failure?
I guess the question is for who? I think for the Yugoslav people, you could argue that it definitely hasn't been a success. But for the international institutions involved, the organisations that needed a role after the end of the Cold War, they found a whole load of tasks. If you go to the former Yugoslavia today, there's thousands of NGOs, institutions, the EU, NATO, the World Bank, IMF, and it's a peculiar success for those institutions. They're still peace building 20 years later, but it hasn't been a success for the people that live there.
Of course, if it were not for these military, financial, political, institutional outgrowths in the former Yugoslavia, there'd be no economy at all, would there? Bosnia, 60% of the people of Bosnia are unemployed, even with the presence of all these people there.
That's true, and that's why I guess there's a lot of people there that wouldn't like the international institutions to go. But unfortunately, once you've wrecked the cake, it's very difficult putting it back together.
Once you break it, you own it. Unfortunately, we don't own it, but we are paying for it. What's been the cost to the taxpayer in this country, in the European Union, of this period of war followed by 20 years of peacemaking?
You could argue it's been a huge cost to the taxpayer, but then many other things are cost to the taxpayer as well. I think the real problem is probably the lack of accountability of how that money has been spent and where responsibility for failure lies. And I think it's really unfortunate, as we saw in the recent Serbian elections, the protests in Bosnia. There's a protest against local politicians when in fact they have very little say over policy making, and the EU in the background that's actually managing most of the policy and the accession process can then lecture those politicians and those people and blame them for those problems.
Well, let's talk about Bosnia first, because there is this talk of a Bosnian spring. People are furious with the pathetic nature of the local politicians, who are, as you've just described, pretty well powerless in any case. But the tripartite nature of Bosnia as a state with a rotating presidency, how's that going?
Clearly it's not going well, and there's elections at every level very often. But as you say, the politicians don't have much power, and that makes democratic discussion quite difficult. It makes political accountability quite difficult. And it's very unfortunate that, as we've seen recently, the result of that has been, I guess, a revolt against the politicians, and then that allows the EU regulation to be seen as somehow neutral and potentially positive. I think the whole discussion of local politicians being a barrier or a problem is a very problematic one, especially coming from the European Union, obviously not a big fan of democracy either.
It's not guaranteed to survive, is it? Because the Serb part of the Bosnian state doesn't really want to be there, and has recently been seeking Serbian and even Russian help to stabilize their situation, and would really rather be in that orbit.
There's a lot of politics and a lot of political claims, but I think because politicians don't have a lot of power and authority, the rhetoric can sometimes be very different from the reality on the ground. And I think often inter-ethnic, internationalist disputes are then sort of blown up when they don't have that much content. We're not in the middle of a war situation. Most people realise that politicians can't do much to defend them, and that's why there's such a protest against them. But it's not as if there's an alternative political movement emerging, unfortunately. It's more of an anti-politics movement.
Being organised.
No, and I think that's really the fault of the European Union's way that it's handled it. The way that policy-making is no longer accountable. It seems that there's no alternative apart from joining the European Union. The EU Integration Directorate manages all the policy-making. Yeah. And if you look at Bosnia and Kosovo, I mean, their flags are designed by the European Union. They look like European Union flags. The national anthem is designed by the European Union. It's really quite tragic to think of these countries as somehow being distant from the European Union, and their problems being the problems of their local politicians.
Yeah.
Let's go to Kosovo then. Here we have to make a comparison. Angela Merkel said that to compare Crimea to Kosovo is shameful. And John Kerry and William Hague, as we said in the introduction, don't even blush when they refuse any comparison between the two. But the Western countries recognize the unilateral independence of Kosovo and are dragging us back to the Cold War over a democratically expressed decision of the people of Crimea to change their situation, to self-determine their future. How do you square that contradiction?
Well, first of all, not all the Western countries have recognised Kosovo as an independent state. There's a number of European Union members that haven't recognised Kosovo. So Kosovo's status is already unclear in terms of international law, let alone, well, the only legal clarity is that the intervention in Kosovo was against the law, which makes the comparison with Crimea a relevant and important one. But I think the main thing has been that Angela Merkel's position has been quite contradictory when you consider how the European Union was encouraging the oppositionists and undermining the fundamental compromise in the Ukraine between the West and the East. And once there's an external intervention like that, there's much less need for compromise. I think it's a similar process to that I was saying about Bosnia and Kosovo, where it seems that the EU is very distant from these problems, but in fact has been very much involved.
Well, 110 countries have recognized Kosovo's independence. That's a lot of countries. Britain and the United States are gung-ho, were gung-ho always for the breakup of Yugoslavia, then the further breakup of Serbia. First, the breakup with Montenegro. Secondly, the breakup between Kosovo and Serbia, whether Serbia liked it or not. So I suppose the point I'm making is these hypocrites striding around the world and from TV studio to TV studio, denouncing what's happened in Crimea, even though they are themselves responsible for what has happened in Crimea. They are the people, as you say, who poured petrol on a low-burning flame in Ukraine and made the people of Crimea believe that their situation was now untenable in the new Ukraine. Am I not right?
Yeah, so that's right. Obviously, the fears that, as you say, were underneath the surface were ignited or exaggerated by the Western turn to the European Union, the lack of a vote, the threat to Russian-speaking riots. And you can understand those concerns. And so Russia in the Crimea was doing little different, I guess, to what the European Union was doing with the leaders in the West. But that's often the case in countries with a delicate balance. External neighbours, when they intervene in those politics, they undermine that external balance. And so I think the real hypocrisy is not so much around the independence, but the idea that Russia is more undermining than the European Union has been. It's clear that Ukraine is torn between those two. And I think it's always the case that when you have external powers dictating the politics of it, it's going to be problematic. And unfortunately, once that happens, there's very little chance for a domestic process. In Bosnia or Kosovo, it's very difficult for domestic politics to have any relationship to society unless you have the authority of policy making. And you could maybe see it with the end of the Cold War, with the breakaway of many states in Central and Eastern Europe from domination by the Soviet Union. They didn't really have a chance to develop their own independence before integration into the European Union meant another type of dependency.
Is the disintegration of Yugoslavia now complete, or is it going to further disintegrate? And are these places going to continue to be burdens on the rest of us because they are essentially foreign protectorates?
I'm not sure if I would say that they're burdens on us, the burdens of protectorates and stuff. I think that there's a burden for the people that live in the region. There's a lack of democracy, a lack of possibility for political alternatives. But I often used to speak to Paddy Ashdown, who was the EU dictator over Bosnia for a long time.
He's still dictating. He was speaking in Sarajevo just this week.
He loves democracy that much. But his point was, because it's our money, because we're helping them with our taxpayers' money, they don't really have a right to decide what their policy should be. And so I don't really go with that idea.
You don't go for that language, and I can understand why, and believe me, I ain't no Paddy Ashdown. I don't want to intervene in the affairs of the people of the Balkans, and I don't want to pay for them either. I've got enough to pay for here at home. We've got enough problems of our own without trying to sort the streets of Sarajevo. That's my point only. Professor, we need to continue this discussion because this story is going to run and run. Professor David Chandler, thank you. After the break, Seamus Milne, Associate Editor of The Guardian and author of the epic book, The Enemy Within, the story of Thatcher's Britain in the 1980s and beyond, joins us to discuss the life and death of the greatest socialist leader of the last 50 years in Britain, Tony Benn. We'll be right back.
Welcome back to Sputnik. The Right Honourable Tony Benn will shortly begin lying in state in St Mary's Undercroft in the chapel at Westminster.
It is a signal honour being paid to perhaps the greatest parliamentary figure since Charles James Fox. The more remarkable because Mr Benn's intentions were, if not like Guy Fawkes, certainly were to thoroughly cleanse the stables of the British Parliament and its unwritten but all too oppressive constitution. I knew him well, and for 40 years. I was one of the original Bennites and was at his side throughout his struggle for power, ultimately unsuccessful. And right behind him as Vice President to his presidency of the Stop the War Coalition. Joining us to discuss the life and times of Mr Benn and the meaning of his death to the British left is leading journalist and author Seamus Milne. Seamus, we both knew Mr Benn very well for many decades. Let's just remember for a moment just how great he was.
Well, he was an outstanding figure in British politics and on the left, and one of the things that was so unusual about him was that where many people in left-wing politics start on the left and move to the right, Tony Benn did the opposite. He started as a sort of centre-right figure in the Labour Party under Hugh Gaitskell in the 1950s, and he moved progressively towards a much more radical position in the 70s and 80s. And, of course, he was vindicated on the great issues and controversies of our time, from, you know, the so-called free market system that was ushered in Britain by Margaret Thatcher, to the great Western wars that have been fought in the past decade or more. You know, he was proved right about those things, and he had a huge following in the country. People loved him in Britain in a way that perhaps no other politician today has been loved. And that's because he was seen as an extremely honest, committed, principled guy who'd paid career-wise for standing for what he believed in, who'd voiced something on behalf of millions of people that had been shown to be right, that had articulated the interests of millions of people in the country and beyond. And that he had achieved things as well, from, you know, constitutional change, from, you know, changing the rules about so he could stand for Parliament when he'd become a hereditary peer, to the referendum on the European Union in the 1970s, introducing referendums in Britain. He was really responsible for that. He was a key figure in in building the support for the alternative economic strategy in the 1970s, which really has got its echoes today in what we're trying to do in relation to the crisis and of the neoliberal order that we're living through at the moment. And then, of course, he made huge democratic changes in the Labour Party in the early 1980s and was at the centre of the great conflict you know so well.
Yeah, I want to talk to you about that, because coverage of his death has been relatively benign, a bit patronising, but relatively benign, as if he were a national treasure. But of course it was not ever thus. When he was alive and kicking and struggling for power and almost achieving it, he was the most hated man in Britain, if you believed the mass media, which spent acres of newsprint to tell us that not only was he bad, he was almost certainly mad.
I mean, it's incredible when you think back to that time in the 70s and the 80s, when many people in power and positions of privilege in Britain thought that Ben was going to lead some kind of revolution, constitutional or otherwise, against them, and that he stood for something that was really about to come to power and was very challenging to their interests. And he was absolutely savaged in the media, in which there's few parallels for the level of attack, I think, that he suffered. I mean, as you were saying, I mean, it was quite a regular feature in some of the tabloid papers in Britain in the 70s and 80s for them to dig out some cod psychiatrist to say it's not just that Tony Benn seemed to be mad, he was actually clinically mad. And this
they used to attribute it to his excessive tea drinking.
Tea drinking. He was a very committed tea drinker throughout his life, and a pipe smoker. No, he was treated unbelievably aggressively and violently.
Because they were afraid of him.
They were afraid.
Because he had two things. Some have one, few have both. He had a very clear political line and direction that he wished to travel, but he had a mass following also. I mean, I've been with him 30 years ago in motorway service stations where the entire kitchen staff would come out to get his autograph. All the customers in the cafeteria would gather around him. He would stand up on a chair and give an impromptu speech. This was a man with a mass following in the country and a very, very radical political take. So they really feared, the establishment really feared, that this man could actually take power. And if he takes power, he might be right when he says, I say what I mean and I mean what I say. Do you think they were right to be afraid of him? How revolutionary was Tony Benn?
Well, he always said himself, I'm not a revolutionary and no one is a revolutionary in Britain. But I think that he was just, he didn't want to give...
Didn't want to frighten the horses
Frighten the horses, or give undue airs and graces to what he was doing. I think he wanted to see a profound transformation of British society. Clearly he was anti-capitalist. He wanted to see a transformation of the way the economy is run, who owns and controls it. He was a great Democrat. He believed in the power of democracy at all levels of society.
In the workplace as well as in the ballot box.
And he was genuinely, and people understood that, I think, that he was genuinely very, very committed to the democratic transformation of life. So no, I think they were right to fear him. I think, you know, in a way, he came to his prominence and the peak of his power at a time when the left was on the cusp, not only in Britain but throughout the world, of entering into a period of long-standing retreat, which we're only just coming out of now, I think. You know, the peak of his powers in the 70s and the 80s, and of course that was followed by the collapse of the Soviet Union, the retreat of the left throughout the world, the breakup of the organised working class movement in many countries. But as I say, I think particularly since the crash of 2008, I think that we're in a different era, and I think he lived to see the time when, you know, socialist ideas and progressive ideas that he stood for are once again, you know, getting a mass following, and for example in parts of the world like Latin America. And of course he was loved all over the world. I mean, not just in Britain. Someone was telling me the other day, who was a friend of Hugo Chavez, the former Venezuelan president, that whenever he turned up in Caracas and saw Chavez, Chavez would say, "Ah, Richard, how is Tony Benn?" And that's what Chavez wanted to know, because he had followed Tony Benn's career and his ideas and his, as you say, his mass following, his ability to popularize socialist ideas and progressive ideas in a way that could appeal to people in simple, aphoristic terms. And he was a great communicator.
Seamus, I met Tony Benn a couple of times, and the last time he even had his pipe with him indoors. Oh, it doesn't matter. But he was
an unrepentant smoker,
yeah,
in fact. No smoking laws meant nothing to Tony.
No, he
was
just
a revolutionary to the end.
He was getting ready to get on stage with his pipe behind. It was amazing. He's a very kind, adorable man. And how was he personally? And how did you know him personally?
Yeah, I think he was an incredibly kind guy, and he was, you know, he was completely without side to him. He would deal with anyone, whether they were a president or the person working in the kitchens, in the same way. He treated everyone with respect, and people understood that, and they saw that. You know, some young person would come and start buttonholing him about something, and he would listen to them and take them seriously. There's the famous story that has been replayed a lot in recent days of how the comedian Ali G tried to set him up for humiliation.
And
of course,
didn't even...
Tony Benn took it completely seriously and said, "Oh, these things you're saying are quite wrong. You know, you shouldn't talk about women like that," and so on. And in the end, Tony Benn got the better of it without even realizing it was a comedy sketch.
Yeah.
So he was. I think he was a really a very, very kind and generous person, a very serious person who took people. You know, actually, completely on their own merits, but he also had a sense of humour, and that came out a lot as well. So, I mean,
I described him the other day as like the kindly old gentleman at the back of the train in The Railway Children. The old gentleman who used to wave his handkerchief at the kids and then help to solve their crisis. That's the kind of man that he was. But he's gone now. Perhaps the single charismatic leader of which he was a perfect example. Will not be easily replicated, and maybe shouldn't be, because after all, leaders can come and can go, and there are many parts of the world too where placing all one's hope and faith in one person can often be dangerous.
That's completely true. I mean, but in a way, in the left in Britain, we've had a number of charismatic leaders. We've been fortunate to have that. You know, in the period we were talking about in the 70s and 80s, you know, we had people in trade unionism like Arthur Scargill. We had people in local government like Ken Livingstone, who became the focus for these mass movements for change, and Tony Benn and others. And I think, you know, real life throws up these people, and sometimes, you know, people who've been one thing, like Ben was early on in his career, when there's a movement which is drawing mass support, they gravitate towards it themselves, as he did. So people who are one thing at one time can then play a different role in another period. And I mean, I think you know, of course, you shouldn't put your faith in single leaders or charismatic leaders for the reasons you said and many others. But of course, we need people to articulate the mood and the spirit and the ideas and the movements of our time, and the way progressive ideas and demands of our time need to be articulated. And we need people to do that at all levels of the movement, all levels of society, both in Parliament and in trade unions, in social movements. And I think those people arise and are arising, and that's not just happening in Britain, it's happening in other countries as well. So Tony Benn's died, and Bob Crow, but they are being replaced and will be replaced by other people, and I think that's not our problem. Our problem is to find a way in this time to articulate and take forward those ideas and those interests in society which have been so denied a real voice in politics for the last generation. I think that is happening, and it's happening all over the world, and it's also happening here.
As Che Guevara said, it matters not that I fall. What matters is how many come forward to pick up my rifle.
Absolutely.
Remembering Tony Benn, Seamus Milne of The Guardian. Thank you very much. Now it's your turn to tell us what you think in the social media roundup. What's rattling, Gayatri?
So, Tony Benn is no more, so what is left of the left? Jack Tipple says, very much still alive, as much now as ever, just woefully underrepresented in Parliament. And Peach says, as long as socialism is seen as a dirty word, the battle continues. The left needs to come together now.
We don't have to call it socialism. We could call it social democracy. We can just call it for each individual policy.
Yeah, because it is indeed a dirty word, yeah?
Well, up to a point. I was once present at a conversation between Fidel Castro and the late Hugo Chavez, in which Fidel, believe it or not, suggested to Chavez to stop talking about socialism. Just do socialist things. people will like them, then later you can explain to them.
Regarding the former Yugoslavia, Shafiat Rashid says Russia was right. Recognizing independence of Kosovo opened up a whole Pandora's box, which later came to haunt the West regarding Crimea.
Well, I mean, they're just hypocrites. You cannot possibly say that Kosovo has the right to unilaterally, illegally, against the United Nations Charter and international law, declare itself to be independent, but that Crimea cannot. It's just sheer, total, utter hypocrisy. Shameful, as Mrs. Merkel might say.
But they're the other way around.
The other way around, yeah.
Okay, well, that's it for this week.
Well, that means, unfortunately, that's all we've got time for.
You know where to reach us on Twitter, RT_Sputnik, and on Facebook you can like us on Sputnik on Russia Today. It's goodbye from me, Gayatri.
And from me, George Galloway. It's been marvellous.